sometimes I like to start these things with a bit of an interactive exercise. And so my question to you, show of hands, how many of you have either written or read the phrase from coast to coast to coast in the past few months? Okay, yes, I'd expect that's all of us, because it's a turn of phrase that we use a lot when we talk about Canada. Most of us in this room, I imagine, are Ontario-based, so we can take for granted the fact that Canada holds the world's longest coastline across the Atlantic, Arctic, and Pacific. Canada's coastlines are among the most economically and ecologically significant, supporting fisheries, marine industries, and Indigenous and coastal communities. And like in every other aspect of our lives and the economy, AI is reshaping how we monitor, manage, and make decisions about these waters. As AI systems and tools become more embedded in Canada's ocean economy, the same critical questions that we grapple with in other sectors arise. Who owns the data? Who controls the models? Who makes decisions? Who's held accountable when something goes wrong? And these questions sit at the heart of the theme underpinning today, digital sovereignty. And so I'm joined by three excellent speakers. Christiana Cavazzoni, Assistant Deputy Minister and Chief Digital Officer at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Sarkis, Abrahamian, Director of Business Development, Government and Defense at Evertz. And Taher, CEO and co-founder of Goflek. And so today we're going to talk about a few things. What are some of the practical AI applications being used in Canada's coastal economy? How are digital sovereignty considerations being embedded into the adoption of these tools? What are the opportunities to further advance AI adoption along Canada's coast? And what are some of the key challenges to harnessing the benefits that AI poses? And so to give all of our panelists a chance to welcome themselves and speak to you within the first few minutes, I'm going to start off with a rapid fire question. And so I'm going to take the long route to get there first. Digital sovereignty has been the buzzword of the year in digital policy circles. There's no doubt about it. And there are a lot of competing definitions. Right now, somewhat of a working definition is the ability to own and control data, digital infrastructure, and IP. And at a high level in our prep chat, we discussed how digital sovereignty exists, sort of on a sliding scale with different trade-offs between availability and cost and controls, depending on the use case. And so my question to you folks, in 60 seconds or less for each of you, is what does digital sovereignty mean to you in the context of Canada's ocean economy? So I'll start with you.
Thank you for the question. So it's great to see you all here today. I see some familiar faces, actually, which kind of surprised me. Hi. So what does ocean digital sovereignty mean to, how would I define it? It has to meet Canada's interests. The ocean is a big space. There's a lot of equities. There's obviously a domestic component. There's a global component. And the question is, where do we strike that balance? So whatever we look at from a deployment of technology data, sensors and so forth, if it's in the Canadian context, then we need to apply mechanisms to that we can control and align to Canadian legislations. If there's a global component, then we need to look at a more balanced act, I would call it, especially nowadays. There's a marine security nexus, fisheries management nexus, and of course, as well, Indigenous communities on the coast. So that's how I would frame it. It isn't just about Canada interest. I can give you numerous examples. I know that was 60 seconds about, vessels that are entering Canadian waters and are allowed to do that and fish. So what do we do as a response of that? And that's what I mean in terms of striking the right balance.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Nice to see everyone. From my perspective, it's more from an infrastructure. So infrastructure perspective, it's the plumbing and what exists in the background that I think would be the definition for the sovereignty side. We're very used to, in Canada, kind of using foreign type technology. We've been doing it for years. It's kind of the easy button to move forward on things. But I think one of the biggest shifts that we should see hopefully happening is that shift over from the infrastructure side. So that way, if we can actually take the sensor fusion data coming in, but still transport it in a Canadian-based system, I think that would probably be the starting steps to actually seeing a true sovereign system.
sovereignty to me is all-encompassing. You can't have somebody who's half pregnant, and I think you can have half sovereignty. And the way that manifests in the digital world is the infrastructure layers and the AI layers that we're using and building on top of, right? All the extra things on top, like the fancy dashboards and the applications and all that, that can all be changed without really losing control. But fundamentally, where the data lives, how the models are trained, how they're being used, the software licenses really underpinning the digital infrastructure, that's where sovereignty lives. Because without sovereignty, without Canadians controlling that part, if it's foreign actors, then it's very hard for us to say that we are sovereign in our digital infrastructure, right? And to give you a very concrete example, we look at our ports. A lot of our ports are using American technologies for their optimization. And what does that mean? That means with the Patriot Act in America, they can take all our trading data, and the same trading data they're using to threaten us, to tell us, okay, who we can and cannot do business with, and under what circumstances, and the threat of tariffs, that's all under their control. I don't think that's right. I think there has to be a fundamental shift in understanding how important it is for Canadians to own that digital infrastructure for us to be fully sovereign.
Thank you. So I want to start first with AI in practice and what we're seeing being used. So what are the most compelling uses of AI tools and technology that you're seeing, using, or building in Canada's coastal and ocean economy right now? Start.
So the applications of AI in the ocean sector are so vast. It's such a beautiful spectrum. And, there's everything from marine preservation to autonomous vehicles to all kinds of ways we're using seaweed, to my area, which is more maritime transport and logistics. And in maritime transport and logistics, it's how we compile all this vast amount of data we're getting from our ships and to be able to make sense of it and use it for, risk assessment, maintenance, and things like this. It's aggregating this huge amounts of data coming in from these Internet of Things systems and to make sense of it. And under logistics and ports, it's more how we can have the right kind of predictability, right? Because supply chain doesn't like fluctuation. And so how can we make sure to allocate our resources in advance, knowing that, at certain seasons, certain times of the year, under certain circumstances, there's going to be congestion, right? So these are some of the ways. The reason we are able to do these applications very well is one of the biggest issues in AI today is the black box issue. AI is not transparent, right? So we're a Canadian company that's developed fully transparent AI that is very useful in these kinds of sectors. And also being able to collect and process vast amounts of data, which is usually the case in this area, and to do it in a way that can be scaled cost effectively. So you look at all these combinations together and the fact that we don't run these kinds of intelligences through American servers. That's all purely Canadians. Canadians own and control the data that's going through it. And I think this is a very exciting time for the ocean sector and AI in Canada.
Yeah, I would echo what Jad was saying. So sensor fusion has kind of been, I think, the biggest leap forward where AI has played a big part. You typically in, say, an intelligence room or somewhere where you're trying to make decisions, if you have thousands of feeds coming in, how could 4 sets of eyeballs actually be able to see everything? So AI has been very important, I think, in bringing that sensor fusion data together, keeping the human in the loop to always have that aspect. And I think probably the efficiency, speed efficiency, to have that data in front of the right set of eyeballs to make a informed decision would probably be the biggest advantage I think I've been experiencing.
So I think my colleagues have covered kind of maritime security flavor. I'm going to go spin it a different way because my perspective is a little bit different. So the big, when we look at AI applications day-to-day at DFO, there's several. We have a full scientific arm. And what do scientists do? They collect a lot of data. They go out on boats, they collect data, they need to store it somewhere. This is where we need to have a conversation about sovereign footprint. And then they analyze it. But it's not, a closed continuum. It's they analyze it for a purpose. And what is that purpose? Species identification, marine conservation, informing industry. informing stakeholders to say, for instance, well, there is a reduction of species X based from the models we're seeing, from the images we're taking from the ocean, and we're going to have to inform industry and upstream, you're only allowed to fish this much. So that's one application that our scientists, for instance, a redfish or species identification is massive in the AI space. The other one that we're actively chasing right now is enforcement. So you probably don't think that fisheries management has an enforcement piece. It does. We actually carry guns. What we do is look at illegal fishing, anything that's on the coast of our country that could be determined as suspicious. So there is a nexus to maritime security. So what are we doing right now to be able to digitalize what these officers need to do to be able to get better informed? And it's all about information and insights. Well, they're wearing body-worn cameras. Oh, that's great. You're capturing things, but what do you do with that data? You need to start looking at advanced analytics and AI practices to be able to analyze and inform you season by season, species by species, many, many fisheries out there that are opening next week. And what do you need to know from past year to be able to inform this year based on trends? So it's massive. Drones. That's another one. Drones is one that we are going to be leveraging as a government. And again, is to be able to give us that overview of the coastal activities and to be able to inform upstream or downstream maritime security and so forth. So there's a lot in the, I would say, more in the scientific experimentation phase, but some of the information that's being produced, for instance, we have an ability right now, it's called Octopus. We love everything that's fish, that actually pulls data from a drone, sits it into our data platform, and from there, we're actually able to inform our fisheries management and our scientific what I would say, sector and scientists for the research and so forth. So numerous activities that can be done in the ocean space. Regulatory is another one that I think we can leverage AI even more forceful. Like the Prime Minister is talking about regulatory streamlining. Well, we're not just going to be able to do that through policy. We're going to have to do that through implementation as well. And to develop new regulations, you need to have information about what's occurring and how you need to tailor it. And what are the socioeconomic or geopolitical things you need to inject on top of the regulation to be able to inform it for the future? So there's a lot in here that can be unpacked.
Thanks so much. So I have sort of two follow-up questions. The first is, and I've even hit both and with me only having to speak once. The first is, what are you also seeing happen globally? Because you mentioned that there's, it's no secret that Canada shares these oceans, that they're international waters. So what else are we seeing globally? I know, Jad, you've been at the UN Ocean Conference and World Ocean Summit representing Canada, so you have some things to speak to. And then the second thing I want to know, but building on that, is how do these applications advance other goals like efficiency, productivity, sustainability, decarbonization? So a two-part question. Maybe I'll...
Yeah, being at the UN representing Canada was fascinating because we're here in our little corner of the world, kind of on cruise control, and the world is moving extremely quickly and extremely dynamically. And actually, you'd be surprised how much incentive there is for Canadian innovators to leave the country. And the ones who stay here because they love Canada and they want to build a future here for all of us. That's part of the reason I decided to stay, because the world is moving so quickly and we've kind of lost track of that. And we're just starting to catch up now. We've had a little shakeup geopolitically that's woken us up to the reality of the world. And I'm very excited to see where we take this. I think there's a huge opportunity now for Canada if we decide as a collective to seize it. And that being said, coming back to decarbonization and all this stuff, obviously shipping is one of the areas where we can make the biggest impact. The IMO, the International Maritime Organization, is extremely ambitious regarding that. And there's all kinds of ways of optimizing ships, optimizing energy efficiency on ships, which reduces carbon, optimizing ports, increases efficiency. The reason we love this area is because civilization and just international trade is what brought people closer together. What's happening right now is a tragedy because when we close ourselves off to others, then we lose what has gotten us here, what has built civilization. So we want to be a part of the force that builds it back up. And I think Canada has a very unique place with the biggest coastline in the world, amazing AI talent to be able to do this kind of thing. So very excited.
So I agree. Lots going on in the world. Globally, we're looking at, a shift and a faster adoption of not just technology, but also being a little bit more aware and conscious of the fact that we do have a data sovereignty urgency, I would say. We collect a lot of data as a government. We collect a lot of data as Canadians. Canadians are becoming a little bit more nervous about what are we doing with our data? And we need to provide ourselves with the mechanisms to be able to safeguard and steward that data appropriately. In terms of streamlining, optimizing, I can just talk about some of the experiences right now that we've taken on. We're big fans of change management and user research. That's been a game changer for DFO because we're actually sending, which we didn't used to, we're sending UX designers out with harvesters. And, harvesters, you might think, well, that's a big deal. Well, harvesters, some of them are, grade 9 educated. And what we're trying to learn from harvesters to streamline their experience through a digital intervention, as I call it, is to understand how they want to work. It's amazing the results we've gotten. I've never seen such an acceleration of digital kind of transformation within DFO by just having that understanding the end user. And that's one thing that is leading up to optimize a lot in terms of digital transformation and so forth. It's amazing how when you have simple conversation with end user, you kind of understand how you need to drive AI because they're looking for more. You're given this much and they want more. And you say, well, we can't do more with this application, but if you collect the right data, we're going to be able to model it in a way where you can see the future, sort of. So I think there is a lot of possibility just in terms of what's going on in terms of trying to understand better in modern practices. But yeah, and I'm gonna refrain from having my own opinion on what the global situation is like. But I think Canada needs to think big.
And I can speak to maybe the global side. So the global situation, I think, has impacted Canada in a positive way to what Jad even mentioned, the stresses of partners in the South and what have you have really woken us up, I think, to realize, we do need to implement something and we do have a lot of work to do. I do see a lot of other, say, countries and nations, really pushing ahead, striving and already having systems in place. We are just catching up. I think Canada has potential to be number one in the world, but it's good to see we're starting now. We might be a little bit late, but we're starting.
Thinking about global, and I'm sure some of you might be aware, like there are countries in the EU, like France, that has now pivoted away from a major suppliers, technology suppliers, American suppliers. This is public news. So the question is why? Well, they're worried about certain things. They're worried about dependency, but also worried about data sovereignty. And the EU has always been a little bit at the forefront of, data sovereignty and the rights of your data. So it's happening. I think we need to look at, and I talked to my colleagues about that, diversify a little bit more in Canada. And I know our Prime Minister is looking at that actively, but we need to put it into practice and implementation.
And so this segues really nicely into what I want to talk about next, which is some of the opportunities. But before we dive into the opportunity, I just want to do a quick pulse check on AI adoption in this sector. Like, is it already deeply embedded? I'm going to say the answer is probably no. Or, is there 10% adoption, or are things still being held together by Excel spreadsheets, or is it a mix of both? So what's sort of the grade of what we're looking at? Because that will lead into what some of the opportunities are.
So yeah, it's more Excel spreadsheets than anybody wants to admit. That being said, I think it's important to just take a step back and ask ourselves, what is sovereignty, right? Because we're defining a lot data sovereignty. And I don't like that term personally, because we had a cybersecurity panel earlier, and you look at data sovereignty, and companies and organizations have taken that seriously for a very long time. We have all kinds of systems, protections in place already, and that's an old conversation. The new conversation is more about technological sovereignty. It's about the fundamental layers that we're building on top of, right? Because if we have foreign ownership there, then first of all, it's very difficult for us to be sovereign. And if they start to do something that is not in the interest of Canadian sovereignty, then first of all, we have no choice. We're kind of screwed. And then second of all, it's going to be too late to change it at that point. So the decisions we make today about technological sovereignty per se are so crucial, right? And so as a Canadian innovator, we started from the beginning, and we designed sovereignty from the beginning and embedded it into the systems we're using so that we can give Canadians the control and the ownership of the technological systems so that they can build them from the ground up, and so that we can design with sovereignty in mind. And I think that's very important to keep in mind as we talk about AI adoptions and scaling AI across the board, is to have that strong foundation.
From I guess the short answer for adoption, I don't see it too much, still very much on the surface level. There is stuff like, cloud being used in Maven, for example. There is implementations from the world we come in, which is media and broadcast. AI is used more. The highlight reels that you see from Hockey Night in Canada is actually run through AI in our system. That gives you a 5-second clip. It's implemented there and probably used 85% of the time. But when you look at it from the government side and defense side, I'd still say, to answer your question, still very much surface level, still new.
From our perspective, we are picking up an adoption of Gen AI tools. That's for sure. We've trained the organization, at the executive level, as an example, and as well at the staffing level. So it's being leveraged. It's being leveraged from Gen AI capabilities. What has been still a ton of spreadsheets, absolutely. But what's been a game changer, or what's going to be a game changer already, is that we've invested in building the foundations. So through a partner, we've partnered with an integrator to help us build the data platform. So this data platform is not just an AI platform, because it is such a thing, really. It's a data management platform, that can catalog your data, especially scientific data, and can actually has all the capabilities to build and exploit that data, either analytics or models. So it's been huge, heavy lifting. When people say, well, I'm just going to do analytics, I know why. Because doing what I just described, it's, first of all, not sexy. And it's not something that, senior management that can really appreciate the nuance of it, or the value creation that comes behind that investment. But it's going to pay dividends. You have to set the conditions for success for AI. You can't just expect to happen. You need to have the proper infrastructure. You need to start thinking about your data. You need to start thinking about data quality. You need to start thinking about, and I'm in a different context, right? I'm in a government context by which we do have checks and balances every time we want to deploy AI solution. We do. We have to have full transparency on the algorithm. We have to have the cybersecurity checks. So it takes us, the lead time is long. Now, we're being able to create a chatbot, simple chatbot in 3 months. You probably say, yeah, okay, I can do that in 2 days. Yeah, this is a different context. And the reason that this is a different context is because we're looking after your data. And we have no choice. When we ingest data that doesn't belong to us, we need to make sure that on behalf of Canadians, we can steward it.
And so what are the biggest opportunities? And give us some concrete examples to further advance AI adoption and apply AI to ocean data, both in from a commercial perspective and from the government perspective. And I think we have a bit of an understanding of what's holding it back, but how can we get there?
So I know that one of the major obstacles for us is cost, and having the proper infrastructure to be able to operate and deploy AI solution. I described the data platform. yeah, it's a data platform, but the consumption behind that, we need to worry about that. And I'm not the only department that will say that. That's where we're having some, we need to start taking that into consideration. So any local or Canadian-based solutions that can be maybe a little bit more competitive and provide us with more flexibility will be welcomed. I'm not SSC. I rely on partners to be able to work that out for me, but skills is another one. But there are many companies out there that can provide those services. So I it's not realistic to hire somebody fresh out of university to be able to do that work. Data scientists are highly competitive. Like my colleague said, we're losing a lot of brain going to different countries. So we need to make sure that we're realistic about what are the criteria for success for us to be able to do that. And cost for me, is problematic, because if we don't invest, I think we're going to have very mediocre returns on artificial intelligence.
I'd say the biggest opportunity for us being a hardware manufacturer is the infrastructure side. So the questions of, having a non-foreign based infrastructure is exactly the opportunity for us. And that would then grow out to being able to connect data coast to coast in real time, and in a way that's already been proven. This is nothing new. It's stuff that is truly dual use, off the shelf. We're doing this a lot with media and broadcast, and have been for over 30 years, where, you have small data centers within each of these small media facilities. Now bringing that infrastructure in a proven way to Canadian type applications, I would say, is probably the biggest opportunity, and will probably be the biggest advantage and sea change that we'll see.
Yeah, and I would echo, going with the infrastructure, proper infrastructure layout is also how do we integrate the proper intelligence layers to go with them. And one of the areas, especially with shipping, is, it's a complex systems. You're dealing with a lot of moving parts. You're dealing with legacy systems typically. So the opportunity is, how can we bring in a fresh way of thinking, right? So with shipping, for example, concretely, you look at ships. We decided to look at ships as almost a human being with different organs, different parts of the body, and also to look at it in the sense that they have their own behavior, unique behavior, each one of them, right? So when we applied this way of thinking from kind of behavioral analytics and kind of medical thinking onto ships, it's kind of a completely new way of looking at the issue. And that helped us have breakthroughs in terms of the way we see fleet optimization, the way we see predictive maintenance, the way we see risk modeling. So I think that's the role of innovators, essentially, is to bring a fresh perspective to an issue that already exists, that, people are applying the same way of thinking to. So I think that's a big part of the opportunity, is just looking at things in a new way. For ports, I think because there's about 1,000 container ports around the world, people have solved the problem somewhere. And actually, luckily for us, one of the best ports that I've seen around the world is in Canada, is in Halifax. They've essentially built kind of an operation room where the innovators can bring in their technology without exposing their IP. They created this kind of middle ground, and then the port is able to put its operational data through it without exposing the data to the innovators to train models in ways they don't want, right? So I think they put in the right thought behind it. They built the infrastructure for it. They've kind of started scaling it out from there. They've done an amazing job. In Canada, I think that's one of the best examples. And even globally, I think that's one of the best examples. So we can be inspired by kind of what's already being done and not having to reinvent the wheel. And I think that actually what they did in Halifax at the pier solved one of the biggest issues, which is data sharing and the data privacy issues. And that's one of the reasons a lot of companies are maybe reticent to work with innovators. So they created this middle ground that works for everybody, which is great. And I've seen other ports around, like other countries, do amazing work, which I don't know how much with Canada and the environment we have in the unionization we could actually get done. But we can still be inspired by. One of them was how what they'd created essentially. I was just in Africa. It was my first time, and it was fascinating to see that the world is moving so quickly. They had leapfrogged in terms of innovation, and what they were able to do was they centralized the intelligence for the whole country through one agency. So as an innovator, we had a one-stop shop, and I wish we had something like this in Canada. I don't know how realistic it is to get it done, But the idea is to make it as easy as possible for innovators to be able to work with the people they need to work with. It's hard enough to already come up with technologies. So how are we facilitating as a country for innovators this entry into new markets, right? And I think Canada's Ocean Supercluster has done an amazing job at that. But unfortunately, their funding is about to run out and we don't really have a replacement. They've de-risked a lot of the big AI and ocean projects that we've done so far. And so right now in Canada, we're in an interesting time where we're coming face to face with, do we actually care enough about this sector? Do we actually care enough that the world might pass us by? Do we care enough that we have the biggest coastline in the world? Do we care that innovation in this area is kind of almost an arms race that's happening around the world, including the Arctic, which is a big part of our sovereignty, which we barely touched on, right? So these are big questions that we're coming face to face with. And there is no right or wrong answer. I think it takes a panel. I think it takes a collective effort for us to truly understand what these problems entail. And I think it's an exciting time to start bringing people around to start discussing them because the future of our country depends on it.
I'm going to go off script for a second and talk about risk. Very sexy. What would be, how would you help de-risk these innovations for companies and communities that are operating in this space? What would be the priorities from practically or from a policy perspective to the extent that you can enlighten us? I don't know who wants to go first.
I think it's bringing as many actors as possible from different areas of life and not being in our echo chambers. I think we have this tendency of being completely, like government tends to be in its own silo. Private corporations, especially big corporations, tend to only work together. Especially in Canada, we've had a lot of brain drain that's happened because of this slowness of adoption, right? Academia has its own kind of world. We're amazing at AI research. We suck at AI commercialization, which is a disgrace, by the way. But without going there, I think the most important thing is to start bringing actors, creating, I think, like partnerships between academia, big private, small private, innovators, and government, as many of them as we can in certain projects. And that's what OSC had done. That was their aim, is to bring kind of a trifecta together. I think we can go further than that because we have amazing academic institutions. We have great corporations, including Evertz, by the way, who's done amazing work on human in the loop and some of the infrastructure projects. We have a government that's very cooperative, that people trust, and we have great innovators that the ones that stay here really care about the country. So let's make something of it. I think it's really having these conversations and more of these conversations. So by the way, thank you for putting these conversations together.
I'll echo that. Yeah, I think having being just more open and meeting a lot more different companies. I'll say over the past year and a half, I've met so many companies within Canada that I had no idea existed. But with the announcement of, Canada First, Ontario Buy, we saw everybody kind of come up. So why were we not having these conversations before? A lot of the common things I hear is, well, we're already doing business with the US. We're going to keep doing that. No need to focus in on Canada. But I think, the time is now, and the more books we open and doors we open, more conversations like this, I agree. I think it's the most helpful thing.
Yeah, I agree with all that. Although, it's tough to reconcile industry interest versus government interest. And this is where it gets really, really messy. We all get along, but when we start putting on the table some of the constraints that we have as a government, then there is, well, okay, but yeah, those are the constraints. So I think industry needs to understand more of the constraints. We need to relax some of, I would say some of, I wouldn't call it legislative, but some of the controls that we have. Cyber is a perfect example. So you talked about risks. Cybersecurity is a risk. Like the average Canadian doesn't see what's going on out there. There's a lot going on out there. And a lot out there that has to do with some of the things we don't want people to have access to. So we need to be mindful of that reality because not being mindful of that reality is going to put the country at risk. That's as simple as that. So we can do the things, we absolutely can do innovation, but we have to be able to understand some of the risks that are attached to, data integration, data sharing. I mean, we can do that much better. We should be doing that much better in government. But, when you start asking, and I deal with this, when you start asking various communities that, can we share your data? No. So it's kind of a mindset, a Canadian mindset, that we cannot be open or we don't trust each other. And we need to kind of break a little bit more of that barrier, but also be conscious of the fact that the world is not getting friendlier. And we need to make sure that the controls that we put in place, especially as we start raising our ambition around AI, we take that into consideration. I do worry because a lot of the AI solutions that we have, I mean, everybody reads about Mythos. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of angst. But it's AI sprawl, right? I think we can do more. The risk that we have is that we have AI sprawl, and that we don't get ourselves in a situation where we're really focused on what we need to invest in AI through private sectors. And I'm saying that intentionally because I think private sector plays a huge role in the implementation of artificial intelligence, and also provide that challenge function. That I'm sure if you and I were having a conversation, there would be plenty of that.
You look like you do want to weigh it.
Yeah, he does look like he's on the season. Yes. Say.
I'm going to go way too off script.
No, let him get off script. Remember, though, you're on YouTube.
I know. That's the best part. No, but I think, look, to go back to something you had said is, I think challenging each other is how we're going to get further. I think we don't challenge each other enough in Canada. We're too polite. We're too nice to each other, especially in the business ecosystem. We've seen businesses completely fail because nobody had the courage to tell them that their business model sucked. That's just the reality. And it's the same thing with dealing with government. And we don't do it enough. And I think now we have no choice. We're being bullied. How do you stand up to a bully? You know the answer.
All right. Okay, so we've talked about it throughout the whole panel, but we'll go back to it again, calling it digital sovereignty. So questions of data location, cloud provider jurisdiction, other procurement choices. On the ground, are port operators, forgive my ignorance in the ocean sector, like fleet management, harvesters, yes, thank you. Are they treating these decisions as sovereignty questions, or as cost or convenience or compliance questions, or a mix of all three?
They just want to get the business going. I have to be honest, like a lot of the industry wants for us to simplify how we interact or report back to us. We are working on it, like the whole regulatory framework, streamlining around major projects, but also looking at some of the work that we're doing in Harvest. Like I just talked about UX research, and massive, because we can actually inform. We can actually inform by talking to them, because you know what? This is overly complicated. Partnering with others, but if you were to talk to the harvesters, the multi-billion-dollar industry that we export, they want simplification. Compliance, I mean, who likes to be regulated, right? But it's also for their own good, right? Because at the end of the day, we can supply them with information that would inform their industry. But that's where I see it as key for our stakeholders.
Yeah, I wouldn't have too much to add to this, but I think from the conversations I've had, it's more or less the question is always, how do we do this? We know what we want. We know what the end result should be. It's just, how do we get there? What's the technology? What is the easy button in order to get us to that point? So I'd say it's probably been the biggest challenge that I've seen.
Yeah, I'd actually agree with that quite a bit. The tendency has been towards compliance heavily and nothing much. This whole idea of sovereignty is fairly new where it's just kind of like now buzzing in policy circles, and suddenly we found this sexy word and we want to throw it around everywhere. But sovereignty is an important discussion. The fact that we're starting to even have that discussion is already huge, because this was beyond the scope of our understanding of the world just a couple of years ago. So I'm very optimistic regarding where this can go. Yes, we're moving more slowly than the rest of the world. Yes, there are countries that are moving at breakneck speed that might pass us by. But we have everything in place here in terms of institutions to be able to start to move in the right direction and to start to formalize this as more than just a thought process. And I think, we have all the key ingredients, and it just takes more discussions like this, and it takes more actors who have the courage to move in the right direction, even when sometimes it's more convenient to work in a way that's not sovereign. But luckily and thankfully, we have a lot of people who love this country and that are willing to make that effort. So I think the next few years will tell. We're kind of like at a point where the next few years will be critical in determining whether or not we will have a future that we can be proud of.
There's something to be said about doing things the right way. Someone give me a time check, please. What time is it?
5 after 2.
5 after 2. Okay. We've been going quickly through this conversation. Is building distinctly Canadian AI capacity for ocean management a realistic goal? Or is deep integration with global platforms just the practical reality for a country like Canada? How do we reconcile those? And given the current policy path that we're on, trying to reconcile those, what needs to be done?
I just don't think it's realistic that we don't expect integration with global companies. It's just not realistic, because we have to integrate with partners. Like I said at my opening remarks was, the ocean is big. What are we going to tell? We're in maritime security. We're navigating. We see something suspicious. We're going to say, no, you're on the wrong platform. We're not going to send you the data. Like, no, it's not going to work that way. You have to really provide that level of data security within the protocol or the standards that they need to operate under. But I think we need to really fuel Canadian innovation. Absolutely. Because we need to be able to be at the table. Right now, what I feel sometimes is that we don't have a choice, right? And I procure what I'm allowed to procure. And what I'm allowed to procure a lot of times is what, it's a lot of US-based or international or global companies. But the net of it is, I think we should try and maybe start experimenting around what does it look like. But when it comes to kind of more integration with partnerships and, in security with allies, it's not realistic to say that we're just going to work from within. We obviously have to interoperate with others. Ships are an example of that, right? You can't, vessel management system has a view of the world, a view of the ocean. So, and you don't know what platform those individual entities are running. So I think we just be platform agnostic as much as possible and maybe focus more on data interoperability.
Yeah, interoperability, I think, is the key part. The short answer I would say is yes, of course we can do it. We want to be our own infrastructure and we can provide that. I'm coming from a different view. But additionally, yes, there is interoperability that has to take place. There is not one or two manufacturers out there building IP switches, for example. There's so many. So being able to communicate with those at a hardware level, at a software level, very interesting, very important. But to make the first steps to actually at least own our own infrastructure or make steps towards that, I think is key. And but as far as data sharing, why don't we actually have the control to say, yes, we want to share this data, we don't want to share this data. As of right now, it more or less feels like we have no choice. So having that choice to actually say A or B, I think would be fantastic.
Yeah, I think the government is its own animal, so you guys have your own way of operating, obviously, with a very a strict vendor list. But I think in general, if we're looking at policy, we're talking about policy, right? The goal of we want to be, let's say in 5 years, 50% sovereign doesn't exist yet, but that would be a great goal. And the goal to say, okay, and we want to be at 100% in 10 years. Like, why not set these kinds of objectives, even if we don't reach them? Because to your point, there's all kinds of constraints. Even bigger companies, are taking innovations that are happening around the world without having to reinvent the wheel. Like, there's definitely going to be some of that, and there's a huge value in that. But I think to have that objective and to have that vision, we haven't seen that yet, and I think that's something I would like to see more of. And concretely, where does the rubber hit the road with that? It's with the right kinds of partnerships, bringing the right people together. So, for example, give you a very concrete example. We're in a building here. Sarkis and I met at an MDA Space event. MDA Space is actually in this building, funny enough. Mike Greenleaf from MDA Space said that there have huge amounts of data that ocean companies can benefit from, and that ocean companies never even thought to reach out. But they've been collecting this data for so long, and the ocean sector would have to reinvent the wheel versus just reaching out to them. They're a fellow Canadian company, right? So sometimes these connections are there. We just don't even think of them, and we don't go out and reach out enough within our own business communities to be able to make these things work. And I think that's where I would see it as a practical starting point. It's to start with these kinds of partnerships. And I think it only takes a few good examples like this, and then suddenly Canadians will start pointing to them and say, oh, look what happened here, look what happened here. And that will create a positive momentum. And that's what we'd like to see.
It's all good news for the open internet.
Yeah.
Okay. The marine sectors that solve problems that other industries are also now just confronting. And so what are one or two lessons from Canadian maritime innovation that you think other sectors like energy, transport, logistics could use?
Thank you to you guys. Seeing view of other sectors.
So I think one of the biggest things that applies not just to other sectors, but to AI in general is the black box issue. So transparency, right? And the reason this is becoming to the forefront is, first of all, in the maritime sector is regulated. We need to understand in very, very high stakes environments why the AI is making certain recommendations and why it's acting a certain way. We need to be able to audit the decision-making process, right? And this is something that in general, big tech companies and a lot of AI companies do not want to talk about, because it's something that is against the way that they operate, against their business models, etc. But ultimately, when you look at what's happening now, the godfather of deep learning, Yoshua Bengio, who's a Canadian, who's one of the biggest AI brains in the world, recently had this moment where he was holding his grandchild and realized that the decisions he makes today are going to impact the way that his grandchildren are going to live. And one of the biggest issues that comes to mind is these non-transparent black box AI systems is we can lose control of them. And that's a big danger. Like the decisions we make today about the AI infrastructure we build literally has an impact on the future that we want to live in. It's not about cool and sexy engineering. It's about what we're going to do with the future of our civilization. It's a very big question, I know. This is very intense. But I think what is important to keep in mind is that without this transparency, without this understanding of these AI systems, then we're forgetting something that Native people in Canada have been talking about for forever, which is the decisions we make today are going to be crucial for the world that we want to create. And every decision we make, major decision, has to take future generations into consideration. And I think we can learn a lot from our Native friends about this topic.
I would say remote connectivity is probably the one thing from the maritime side, just because of the amount of data coming in. Not having connectivity all the time, being in remote areas is probably one of the big benefits that does apply into different defense and government, especially you can say in RCMP or OPP, being in locations that don't have connectivity. There's a lot that can be learned from the maritime experience. To be able to make those connections, the uplink, the downlink. So very much from a technical side, and learning that workflow, I'd say, is the big one.
Yeah, actually, I would agree. I agree with that. We still have challenging connectivity issues in the Arctic. Of course, we haven't solved that. So if we can solve that, but all of this is in partnership. So it's kind of hard to pin down a sector. If I think about some of the kind of innovation that's coming out, let's call it innovation for the sake of the conversation here, but the innovation that's coming out of DFO, one could think could be applied to defense. So there are things that we are working with, especially on the enforcement side. We're more nimble, so to a certain extent we can move faster. I think that's one area that we need to explore as a government is, just because large departments have more cash, more funding, does not actually mean they're going to deliver more innovation. So when I joined the government from high tech, I kind of realized that it says, well, where is your R&D hub, right? If we actually had an entity that can work, and we stand these things up, and then we think about it and we don't give it the time for it to come to fruition. But I think overall there's a tendency to just continue doing things the way we've been doing them. But if we wanted to actually do some really useful stuff that can be redeployed across various, let's call them sectors, I call them more government services, then we should be looking at that as the first wave of thinking around AI reuse.
Okay, I think we're getting close to the close. So I have one final question. Because life is a series of choices. If you had to choose, what would be your top 3 priorities for digital sovereignty and AI adoption along Canada's coastlines?
So, digital sovereignty and AI? I would say data integrity for us. Having good data, being able to store that data. So that's the second piece, the storage of the data. And the adoption. We can't expect to just, pull AI solutions out of a hat and then get citizens or internal stakeholders or industry to just pick that up. There's a whole change management piece to it. But we don't spend enough time talking about data integrity, and we see it every day. Like, if you don't have good data, you might as well. We have a lot of data. That's the thing that we can't really store anywhere.
Yeah, I think I'll agree with you on that. So definitely the data side, the infrastructure portion, of course, which I'll keep harping on, is probably the big one, the management. And being able to share and transmit that data to multiple points. Canada is fairly large, so having a unified view from a national level and also being able to stovepipe that down into, say, provincial or sectored approaches is probably, I'd say, my top 3.
I love what you said, data integrity, infrastructure. I think speed is also very important when we look at how quickly things are moving around the world, and how AI is almost like an arms race, and Canada has started off in a very good position and we're slowly losing that. I think we have to be aware that moving faster than we are right now is going to be crucial if we want to actually thrive as a nation and build a future for that we can be proud of. And I think to do that, we've gone in the right direction. We built certain infrastructures. You look at what they've done in Halifax, they're doing the same thing in Quebec now. So things are starting to pick up, and I think building on that momentum is going to be huge. And then finally, I would say it's sustainable partnerships. It's putting the right people together in the right rooms. And so I think that's exactly what we're doing. Internet Society, Orchestra is doing that. And I think a lot of people here in Ottawa are passionate about having these conversations and moving in the right direction. I'll bet we're moving slowly. I think at least we're starting to move in the right direction. We have all the ingredients. We have everything necessary for us to be way more than just a natural resource economy. Like, we have everything it takes. So I'm very, very curious to see what the next few years are going to be like.
Well, thank you very much. Everybody, please give a round of applause for our excellent speakers.